questions. My name is Lovemore Madhuku. I'm professionally a lawyer. I'm also a professor of law at the University of Zimbabwe. My relationship with the people of Chipinge is that I come from Chipinge, so I'm a Chipinge person myself and relate with the people of Chipinge in my capacity as one of them, and then more importantly trying to help them legally. I would say that the main nature of the land struggle is one of displacement from the areas where they are resident and doing their communal land activities. Historically, most people in Chipinge have been resident where they are on the basis of the ties they have to the land and the activities that they have been carrying out on those pieces of land. I know that from the colonial times, many people who are where they are were there before independence. They were there much earlier than that. We're talking of periods going, I'm sure, perhaps 500 years or so. People were in those areas. And then after independence, they remained there and were enjoying what we now call communal land rights, meaning that they have a right to occupy the piece of land that they have. And then they have a right also to do the activities on those pieces of land. But other people have come in who have an interest in utilizing that land for different purposes and are the ones that are displacing these people. I think that is a very good question. That question must be answered in the light of the answers we ought to give to the nature of the post-colonial state. Is it a state that is focused on transformation, real transformation, fundamental transformation? Or is it a state that believes in merely perpetuating, being a real servant of the bigger political and economic framework that dominates the world generally? I think in our case, in the case of many African countries, the post-colonial states have not been transformation states. They would be happier preserving what is there, managing it to their best ability. But in this case, they are simply more interested in protecting the interests of those that wish to take up this land. And I think they have more rights according to the post-colonial system we have here. I think it is a question of almost all the things that you are mentioning, but I'll start from the legal one. The legal one is quite obvious in the sense that the communal land rights that we inherited at the time of independence, and which we still perpetuate, because I said we have not transformed them, they do not give specific legal rights of ownership or legal rights of occupation that can resist someone who wants to interfere. For example, our law says that the communal land vests in the president, which means that it vests in the state. That means that the state can always play around with that land. It is different from any other form of land tenure where you have private ownership. The state cannot come and take away my land here in an urban area. In Harare, for example, I own a piece of property. I am sure that no one would even try to take it because the law protects it. So I would say that the legal problem is lack of adequate legal protection of communal land rights. And that is why it is easy, because all what it means is that the state claims it is the owner. So the private interested parties or the private businesses, they technically at law go to the owner of the land. And I would wish that I occupied that and use it for this. And according to the law, the owner of the land has all rights to do anything that they please with their land, including evicting people that they are owning there. So it's a weakness of that legal environment. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, I mean that is correct. That we have had an experience where even private land ownership was reduced in terms of its protection mechanisms. But what happened in that case is that the government there had to actually change the constitution to make provision for interfering with private property to that extent. And then I think with the land, then there's also the historical question that had to be addressed. You could have that. But you know that recently, even in South Africa, they have had, it has become impossible also for them to acquire land or take land, private land, without compensation. I mean, the attempts to change the constitution in South Africa failed. Here it was easy to do that. So you are correct that even private land ownership can be interfered with. But that is very limited in very exceptional situations like what happened in Zimbabwe. Perhaps because of that, the government here or the state here has extended that lack of respect for property rights to the communal land area, which is they ought to protect the rights. Communal land rights are property rights like private property rights. They are just different levels or different degrees of property rights. And once you don't respect what can be regarded as the greatest protection, for historical reasons, of course, and justifiably so, to get some land taken away from the former colonial masters, I think that it is rather too much for the state to have taken that further into the communal land area. Yes, I think that from the examples you are giving, I'm happy for that example. Yes, it should be able to work in Zimbabwe. What we have seen in these areas that we're discussing in Chipinge and so forth actually demonstrates the importance of that. I think this period of, or this process of saying that it's communal land and that the government of the day still has rights which they call the state and so forth, can do what they're saying, it's a very serious danger. There is a need to protect every person's entitlement to land. And that entitlement is historical. It's actually God-given. No one put these people in the first place. All the state itself came into being after these people were already in place. I think that in the African setting, you created a Zimbabwe or a South Africa or a Mozambique or a Zambia out of people who were already there. Most of our communities, they predate the existence of these states. So they have more rights than the states themselves. I mean, if you bring out a state in 1891 or 1890 or 1866, when people are already there, then you say you came out of them a state that you call, Rhodesia, or you call what? And then you start taking away the rights of those people. I think that's not fair. Well, I'm sure they had done that, the Mandivamba Rukuni Commission. It's well known for it. I think they did a lot of thorough study or thorough research. One would recommend that. I think the basis of our African settings deal with these things, that communal land historically was owned by communities and then obviously families. So you have a family plot, a family place, which is how people live in rural areas. They will say this area is for this family, this area is for that family. And then if they are registered in family trusts or some other mechanism that shows that it is land held in trust by families for the generation that will come, it might make better sense than if it is the individuals. Individuals may then tend to sell that land or alienate it in a way that might disadvantage other members of the family. And that could be problematic. I mean, instead of these big companies approaching the state, they might approach individuals, and you can also get a chaotic outcome there. So I think that the role of traditional leaders is must not necessarily be to allocate or redistribute communal land. It must be to preserve the land holding processes. I think they should be able to know which family owns which places. and then to ensure that those families utilize the land equitably within the family setting. Let me give an example of a family that owns, that is given a portion of communal area for its, of that family is somewhat disadvantaged because the family is not distributing or allocating its portions to them. Then they should be able to go to the traditional leader for that. But they should not be given the power to take land from one family to the other, or etc. That should be very difficult. And then you could have areas of where new people are coming in, into areas, and they are admitted to be part of a setting. Then their traditional leaders can try and find land for them, which can be found from, there are so many families that either completely get deceased themselves, and then there's no descendant from a particular family. Those are the kind of isolated areas where the traditional leaders could allocate that part of the land to newcomers, if there are any. No, not at all. It's not development in just displacement. Very clearly, in the sense that it is private individuals who are coming into areas that they select for their own private advancement. But they find it inconvenient that that land is actually occupied by others. So then those others must get out. Let's say you want to do some development, you want to put some academia, nurse, whatever it is you want to get involved in that. Like what you get in the upper part of Chipinge. And then because you want to plant those things and to get involved in that business, you get those people out instead of organizing those people to use that land for that purpose. Or you are in the Chipinge area, you want to grow, sugarcane, blah, 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 and so forth. You want to be involved in some ethanol business. You admire the land of those people. Instead of ensuring that these people are involved in that kind of production, then you say the company must do it and that these people must be condemned to poverty. So even you do what they call, I think it's the economists, they might use that, I don't know what they might describe it, but there is they call it a cost-benefit analysis. That's one way of doing it. So you look at in this case, the cost, the amount of poverty you create out of displacement completely outweighs whatever you call development from the input, because this is it. If you get what is happening in the ethanol situation in the Chipinge area or whatever, so you get the green fuel company or Macdom or whoever is engaged, they make lots of money. Perhaps that's what you've been, and they even secure, these blending rice where they sell them. But go around and see what the people there are doing. They are not even able now to grow food for their own sustenance, their own subsistence. That can be development. If someone who was able to produce food for themselves yesterday is unable to do so today, that is clearly contrary to that. I would not separate those. I think the first one to do with private interests, clearly I have said it's not development to the extent that it impoverishes the majority. Then the one that is of the local state, that is a very unfortunate sort of approach, which is where you get a local entity that simply wants to make money out of the land in its communities. It's actually this thing that a local authority must be able to make money in this idea. Let's say you want to get more rates, get more taxes coming in, and then just to fund your budget. It's completely nonsense. It is, I have no good way to explain that, but that is the kind of thing that should not even be tolerated. The argument by the local state doesn't simply make sense. When you compare it to the analysis I've said, you cannot displace these people, reduce them to extreme poverty so that the local authority is able to put up an establishment where it will be able to collect taxes. Because I think that's what they're going to be wanting to do. Yeah. yes, I think that it can become a political, it is both a political and electoral issue. It is a political issue in the sense that the political party that is in government, including the government itself, I think they are not taking into account what is at stake, which is the vested interest of the people there. It's politically unacceptable to allow persons to be displaced or persons to be relocated in the way we are hearing them doing. It's completely politically unacceptable because it creates more problems than it tries to solve. I think they would have seen in some parts, I think in the Mashonaland East, where government had to reverse a decision where they'd given a license to a Chinese investor to occupy some positions there. And the outcry was quite overwhelming, and they had to give in to, which is a political decision, that you can't do that. Certain things, I mean, you have to develop within a community, but without causing so much political pain that is happening. Then electorally, it should make sense for the voters in those places not to vote for, I think, the political party behind the government of the day that is allowing those things to happen. I think that should be, but this will depend on how the voters themselves get to link the government to the problems. We still have a situation where I think some voters may not be able to draw the link, or some voters, they are overwhelmed by the dominance of their political parties. So, for example, ZANU-PF has the government that is there today. ZANU-PF has the president who is there today. My experience that in respect of what is happening in Chipinge, the government has not listened to anything there. It's very clear there. But you might still see the people in those areas calling themselves ZANU-PF supporters and all the way still wanting the president to remain in office, and that they will vote for the president to remain in office without linking the president to the failure by him or the failure by his government to address that point. I think if there's enough political work around that, voters would show it in future elections. Well, I would say overall they're not doing enough. They are doing some work. Yes, I think the only work that the government of Zimbabwe is doing in that regard would be, I think, speaking out and saying that it's important to advance rights of women, for example, that it is important to have gender equality, those things they say. But in terms of practicalities on the ground, I think they are not doing enough. I want to give an indication here that the government itself has a very clear misunderstanding, which comes out from it, of what do you mean by gender equality, what do you mean by women's rights. Let's just go back to the displacement themselves. The majority of the people in all these communal areas, in all these places, are women. That is the first thing. And then secondly, the burden of looking after families is mostly on women. And in my experience in getting to discuss with all these people, women have been very clear in articulating the problems that they are facing and so forth. So if you want to refer to a program where there is oppression of women, it is that whole program on displacement. Whenever you displace anyone, the burden is on women more than it on any other person. And so that's where I'm saying they're not doing enough. Any government that is clearly sensitive to the rights of, would not allow that sort of suffering. I don't know whether there are still people out there who do not understand women's rights, or to the extent of not knowing that these are not separable from any other key issues. You cannot have any issue of development which leads to poverty, which is not an issue of undermining the rights of women. That's my experience. Whenever you create poverty, you are actually making women poorer. Whatever you do in that regard, I mean, that's what we have. Even when we had the time of talking about violence, once you put violence as a weapon, those which will suffer would be and suffer. Yeah. Well, we have been using mainly principles of international law. Some of them are put in the law of Zimbabwe, in the constitution. But I would say that the basic motivation of our law is really an international principle, which is, a right, first, a right to a home. It's an international principle that is respected everywhere, which is a clear principle. And then secondly, it's a right to be able to earn a living, so you have a home, and then you are able to earn a living. And these are principles that are enshrined in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and taken up by the International Covenant on Civil, Social and Political Rights and so forth. And even the Covenant on Social and Economic Rights, they will deal with those. So we then use them to interpret the Zimbabwean constitution in the light of international standards. And now, more fundamentally, we are trying to give a legal basis to communal land rights as an independent right in itself. There is one change that is required. I think the Communal Lands Act must be changed to reflect the fact that putting land in the hands of the president does not give the president the right to then utilize that land without regard to the people who are there, or to reallocate that land to anyone. It is simply, the president is simply a legal fiction of the person who owns, just a legal fiction. But the land is actually owned by the person. That the president is like a trust. When property is registered in the name of a trust, the trust does exist as a legal fiction. It doesn't exist. Even a company, to say that there's a company code, so it does not exist. We can't touch it. It exists as a legal fiction. But there are always individuals behind those. So what the president or the state here misunderstands is when we say that communal land vests in the government, it doesn't give the government substantive rights to utilize that land in a way different. It simply gives the government the legal figurehead of saying, if we say who owns this, it's a real and empty shell. I think that the British, when they created some law that is very well known around the world, the law of equity, and then when they created the trust, the concept of a trust, you hold the property in trust. It is not yours. On paper, you are the owner. So the board of trustees, they are made to run property for the benefit of beneficiaries. So I would want the Communal Land Act to be changed so that the beneficiaries are given substantive rights in the law. And then the powers of the owner who is owning as a matter of trust are defined. And that's it. In the rest, I think it's implementation. I think the scope is very limited within the Constitution, in the sense that there is not a specific provision that grants some land rights to individuals. And you can strain and get some provisions in the Constitution that can be utilized for them, for that. And I think most people that have tried to use the Constitution directly in that regard, they will take provisions that deal with the right to equal treatment, the right to the protection of the law, the right to be able to engage in an economic activity of one's choice, and so forth. But when you come to the land provisions on land in the Constitution, that is Section 71 and Section 72, communal land is actually excluded from the land that the Constitution regards as land in Section 71 and Section 72. So that somewhat limits the rights. So it might involve, if there is going to be any need, some constitutional amendment. If one wants to put it on a firmer basis, for very firm basis. And there's need for those. Well, before, it never used to be like what we are saying. I think under the current government, there is a misunderstanding of what is meant by development. They think that getting these private business people and these big companies high up, the high-sounding, pieces of development, that is development. The current government is not looking at the ultimate impact on the ordinary people in those areas that are affected.
Mm. Mm.
It's a very good question. I have a very clear answer to that. I think it's a colonial mentality. The kind of governments we have in Africa, most of them now, they still haven't come out of that. They are not, I said at the beginning of the interview that these are not transformative states. These are people that still have a colonial hangover. It is only in Africa, in fact, mainly Africa, where you get that outright disrespect for the people, which is what we know with what colonialism did from the 1890s. It did one thing which is so terrible and which has continued despite independence. Get into a place, don't care about what the inhabitants of that place do. Just pursue your interests, don't ask them. That's what colonialism did. You just come, you impose yourself, and then you start mining, you start getting land, you start displacing people and so forth. So when you get independence, you still get people who think that governance, somewhat, at some point, and that's a very colonial thing. You don't always need to consult. But if you go to many of the developed states, I don't think that you will see an American government disrespecting its people to that extent. Or you would see some other, I can mention the kind of developed states and so on. I think this idea of disrespecting people is a colonial mentality which came out. And until Africa gets governments that really appreciate that we are all equal, all our persons are. And I will not be surprised even in the young generation we have, those who are younger than me, who still do not respect people. And I see them, I meet them in university here, the students, much younger. I'm not saying much younger because when I'm referring to much younger people, I'm on the lecturer stuff. But let's say you invoke a discussion in a lecture with students who are 20, 21, and so forth. You'll be shocked what they think. You give them a position as the student leader here. The next thing, they run away with a program without consulting any of the students. They can even come to you and say, Professor, we think that extra lecture you were proposing, we have it at 3. If you don't ask them whether they've consulted with others, the chances are that this is a time that is being set for the class rep. And that's what he wants. He wants it at 3. Then the moment you say, okay, go and form the class, you can put it, they now have what they call WhatsApp groups. Mm-hmm. Then the other students who are more courageous will straight get to your inbox and say, Professor, but we can't have a lecture at 3. And I thought that the class rep has discussed this thing. You get it everywhere. It's a very difficult mentality. And I'm answering your question, why is it there what you are calling a convergence? It's a colonial mentality. Africa still has to come out of that, and it's going to be our biggest struggle here. Once you are in government and you have power, first and foremost, respect the people. So, and then it's worsened by the fact that in many of the processes, most of the African leaders, they get into power through an election where they don't respect the people. So the people themselves are partly to blame. They vote without applying their minds to it. Now, if you are a leader who gets into government, when you just find it cheap to get a vote, which is what we find here. I mean, so if you get the example of ZANU-PF, they want elections every day, despite their performance and so on. But when it comes to elections, they're always confident. You ask, why is that? Part of the reason why is that the voter is such that it makes it very easy for this. So even when you get other groups that are not necessarily in government, when they talk about an election, it's based on a disrespect for the voting population. I have one MP who wants to get back into office. I think they were recalled. They were not doing anything for about 10 years. Then they got recalled. Now, and it's known in the constituents that they were doing nothing for 10 years. But they are likely to be re-elected if an opportunity arises. And now goes back, he attends 1 or 2 funerals there. And you get to the voters still think that, we're waiting for MP when the term, what is that? You vote for this person due to circumstances, without you knowing he was chucked out of parliament. Is this an opportunity to get someone who is better? I mean, I can just give you, I'm just contributing to that debate. I mean, no one is. I think let's go back to principles of what is a moral right and what is not. There are certain things. Who has that moral superiority to be able to then sit around and say, look, I think development which is good is that let's do it this way. We remove. I think the only morally acceptable way of doing things would be to go to the people and you support them there. Any development must work, and it's possible. Any development theory must be able to survive with the people in place, and that the development must be like that. Otherwise, you can end up relocating people from Africa to Asia. Or I think if colonialism had not been stopped, we would have had a situation like that. But somewhat people fought it. But I mean, the way those things were, you would have people getting from one area to the next. I think the better debate in the African Union is the first point that let's work with, even those private companies, whatever they want to do must be done within the thing. Let's say you are a big company and you want to support sugarcane production by the communities there, and then you have a contract with them as to what you get out of them doing it. What is your benefit from payers? You supply the inputs, you supply the machinery, you do everything, and then out of them there's an agreement that the company gets 25% or get 40%. I think things like that can go. I was putting it to say the worst case scenario where you go by the model number one, the first area, would be if they want to fit in there, let them fit there. If they have to do any arrangement, it has to be with the people on the ground. But I certainly agree that right from the start, we work with the people there. It should be their choice whether they decide to bring in a private person to help them. Well, I think that it's not a very honest way of putting things across. I think when it comes to development of land and issues around that, it's no longer correct that Africa at this stage needs the kind of foreign investment which will lead to displacement. Clearly not. I don't know even why they give this investor all that thing to start from the planting and so on, all the way to the producing the fuel. I mean, why would the investor not start there and these people are supplying to them? And these are things that I think are not being worked out. Yeah. So I don't agree that there's an area where they would say that they need the much needed investment. Yes, I think that is the way to go. We need to get to conscientize our communities to be able to ensure that people understand that. I don't think I'm just looking at my generation, which didn't go to the liberation struggle. For me, it simply means that the communal people in Edinburgh must just take a radical approach where they say that land is theirs. And then because it's theirs, anything to do with the development of that or any change has to be with them as agreeing or not. I mean, how do you target the communal land and you're not targeting other land? And so, I mean, let me give an example. Let's say you think that people in Bari, they are now overcrowded and so on, and you want to remove them. And so you want to destroy the entire area in Bari around Stoddard Hall, for example, for good reasons. You don't even think about that. No one would have the political authority to do that. So I think they should take that, we're calling the revolutionary or radical approach. It must start by asserting the rights of communal people and then define certain non-negotiable areas. Then you move on to development.